Yeah.
Yes. We can, yes.
Friends, good evening and warm greetings from the Ecumenical Christian Center. This is the third lecture we organized on this ancient Buddhist Christian dialogue. This evening we have two exciting lectures. Before we begin, I would like to introduce to you the moderator for this evening, where the presenters or the speaker would be introduced by our moderator. The moderator for this evening will be Father Dr. Chirian Karuka Barampil. He belongs to the Archdiocese of the Changanassery, Kerala, and is the secretary to CBCI Office for Dialogue and Desk for Ecumenism since 2018. He holds a Master in Theology from Paurastya Vidyapeetham Kottayam and a doctorate in theology from Catholic University of Salzburg, Austria. He is an expert of Pro Oriente Colloquium Syriacum Vina, visiting lecturer in ecumenism at Paurastya Vidyapeetham, Vadavadul, it's in Kerala, and a Good Shepherd Major Seminary in Thalassery. He is also the secretary to the Syro-Malabar Synodal Commission for Ecumenism and joint secretary to KCBC Commission for Ecumenism and Dialogue. He is an editor section Ecumenism of journal called Christian Orient, published from the Oriental Institute for Religious Studies, India, in Kottayam. And he also published many articles on ecumenism. It's a joy and great privilege to know Father Chirian and work with him through this platform. I now hand over the time to Father Chirian, the moderator for this evening. Over to you, Father.
Thank you, Minlun. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, we can hear.
Okay, good evening to all of you. A warm welcome to this session on Asian Buddhist Christian dialogue. And we are very glad that we have so many eminent personalities in the field of dialogue and ecumenism. And especially I welcome Most Reverend Rafi Manjali, the member of the Office for Dialogue and Ecumenism of CBCI, and also all other eminent personalities. And today we have, I think, an exciting presentations we are inviting, and this is on suffering in the book of Job from the Old Testament of Bible Christian perspective, and also from the Buddhist perspective, we have a suffering, what compels us to practice. And we have two eminent personalities to present. Professor Dr. J. Suratnam and also Venerable Tenzin Lekstok. And I'm very happy to welcome both of our speakers to this session, and also all the participants that you have found time to participate in this evening seminar on suffering, with the theme suffering, and this Asian Buddhist Christian dialogue jointly organized by Ecumenical Christian Center, Whitefield, Bangalore, and Office for Dialogue and Ecumenism of Catholic Bishops Conference of India, and Tibet House Cultural Center for His Holiness the Dalai Lama, New Delhi. And especially I thank the director of Ecumenical Christian Center, Reverend Dr. Matthew Chandragunel, for giving us the opportunity, especially for me, the opportunity to moderate this session. And first of all, I invite Reverend Dr. Professor J. Suratnam to speak on suffering in the book of Job from the Old Testament. And to introduce Professor J. Suratnam, he is a professor of Old Testament since 2010 in the United Theological College, and he has his PhD at the School of Divinity from the University of Edinburgh, United Kingdom, and he has got a Master's of Theology in Old Testament and also Bachelor of Divinity from the University of Serampore, and he has got a Bachelor of Science in Zoology from the Madras University, Chennai, and he is an expert, I think, a language expert. He knows almost all the South Indian languages, especially Telugu, Tamil, Kannada, and also biblical Hebrew and biblical Greek. And we know that he's an expert in the field of Bible and biblical theology and hermeneutics and so on. And today we are very happy to have the first talk from Reverend Dr. K. Jesuratnam, who has got published many of the books, and he has written in many publications, and he has got also special administrative experience, academic administrative experience, and also pastoral experience. And we hope that you will be able to translate the concept of suffering from according to the book of Job, according to the biblical perspective, Christian perspective, to our understanding. Hearty welcome, Reverend Dr. Professor Jesuratnam, and please present us the theme of suffering according to the book of Job.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, for your kind words of introduction. And I take this opportunity also to thank the organizers of this webinar. Especially, I want to thank the Director of Ecumenical Christian Center, Reverend Dr. Matthew Chandran Kunnal, Reverend Minlun, and all others, my friends who are gathered at this time. So I would like to talk about the topic that was given to me on the suffering, the issue of the suffering from the book of Job. And I titled my lecture as follows: Biblical Job, a righteous dissenter from South Asian perspective. Biblical Job, a righteous dissenter from South Asian perspective. Now let me introduce what I am planning to do in this short time. Suffering is a fact of human life on this earth. Moreover, suffering is inevitable, an inevitable experience of all in this universe. All religions, including Christianity, talk about it extensively in their various scriptures. But the causes and the genesis of suffering is presented in different ways in each religion and their scriptures. Suffering of the innocent is seen as a specific issue within the wider question of suffering. More particularly, the question of retribution is understood in a common parlance. Righteous are rewarded for their good deeds, and the wicked are punished for their bad deeds. But this dictum is not always proven or proved to be correct in their practical experience in this world. Instead, the opposite seemed to be the case or the reality. Along with other books in the Bible, the book of Job deals with the issue of theodicy, the righteous judgment of God, particularly reflected in the suffering of Job. The case of biblical Job can be seen in the above light when he questions and protests against the declaration of certain universal truths of retribution theory. That is, the wicked are punished for their bad deeds and the righteous are rewarded for their good deeds. So Job, in that context, or the book of Job was written to break the grip of moralism and dogmatism that was reducing the wisdom to the canards of the formulas about the surface appearances of human life. And of course, this has been demonstrated throughout the book, especially in a dialogue section in the book of Job, especially between the dialogue between the three friends of Job and Job. And all the time the friends were accusing Job of this kind of moralism based on which he was put to suffering. But on the other hand, Job was always refuting their claims. So the book of Job has got a long historical tradition, and it has got very, very wider acceptance in the Christian as well as in other Jewish traditions. And especially now we will look at how the book, before we get into the details of the idea of suffering in the book of Job, let us look at some of the questions concerned with the book of Job in the biblical, and the church and other related religious traditions. Especially, first let us see how the church traditions in the history of Christianity have accepted the book of Job. Christianity accepts the book of Job as a canon in the Old Testament. In addition, Job is also mentioned in the New Testament of the Christian Bible. The Epistle of James in the New Testament, chapter 5, verse 11, paraphrases Job as an example of patience in suffering. Job's declaration, I know that my Redeemer lives, in chapter 19, verse 25, is considered by some Christians to be a proto-Christian reference to the Christ, the Redeemer. And it is also the basis of several Christian hymns. However, Jewish Bible commentators point out that Job insists on the divine hearing in the lifetime, in his own lifetime. Now he is also commemorated, Job is also commemorated by the Lutheran Church and some are also by the Roman Catholic Church in different ways. And the church all through the history recognizes Job as a model, as a paradigm of suffering in this world, as a paradigm of not only suffering but also the patient suffering and endurance and perseverance. The Church of Jesus Christ of later day saints also confirms the existence of Job in the following statement: Thou art not yet as Job, the friends do not contend against their neither charge with the transgression, as they did Job. Later day saints hold in a high esteem the life, example, and righteousness of Job and consider him a model of perseverance and endurance to the end. Now, Job also was found as a parallel tradition and story in the Islamic tradition. In the Islamic tradition, we see Job is considered as a prophet, like many other important figures. Job is also considered as a prophet. Job's story in Islam is similar to the Old Testament story. But in Islam, the emphasis is laid on Job remaining steadfast to God, and there is no record of the bitterness of defiance or mention of lengthy discussions with the friends. Some Muslim commentators also spoke of Job as being the ancestor of the Romans. The Muslim literature, the Islamic literature also comments on Job's time and place of prophecy, saying that he came after Joseph in the prophetic series, and that he preached to his own people rather than being sent to a specific community. Now, the Job also was venerated very much as usual as we can expect in Judaism. The majority of rabbinical Torah scholars saw Job as having in fact existed as a powerful and historically factual figure. Some rabbinic scholars maintain that Job was in fact one of three advisors that Pharaoh consulted prior to the taking action against the increasingly multiplying children of Israel in Egypt. In the episode that is mentioned in a Talmud, in one of the rabbinic important literature, also talks about the Job in this light, and how Job was prominent in the court of Pharaoh. Now there is also the lot of history of interpretation concerning Job, but we will look at it very briefly. In the Second Temple period, that is between 500 BCE to 70 CE, Job began being transformed into something more patient and steadfast with his suffering, a test of virtue and a vindication of righteousness for the glory of God. The process of sanctifying Job began with the Greek Septuagint translations that is done in 200 BCE, and was furthered in the Testament of Job that came in 1st century CE. The 1st century CE, where the Testament of Job became popular. And this reading pays a little attention to the Job of the dialogue section, but rather the Job of the earlier tradition, the prosaic tradition, where Job is portrayed as the one who was a symbol or a model of a patient suffering and endurance. The early church stressed Job's suffering as a lesson in living and as lessons in the liturgy of the dead. Gregory the Great offered him as a model of right living worthy of respect. The medieval church scholar Maimonides declared him as a story of patience, and the medieval Christian Thomas Aquinas wrote a detailed commentary declaring that it is a true history. The story of Job is a true history. In the Reformation time, Martin Luther also explained how Job's confessions of sinfulness and worthlessness underlay his saintliness. And John Calvin talks about Job as is the one who demonstrated the doctrine of the resurrection, and the ultimate certainty of a divine justice. So this goes on. The list goes on. How the interpretation goes on in various centuries, and how the Book of Job, by and large, has been looked at as the model or the paradigm of suffering and patient endurance in the midst of trials and temptations. Now, I have taken one particular concern with regard to the reception of Job, especially in the Indian context where Dalits are suffering. And then the Dalits Christian, especially Dalit Christian, with the Dalit Christian focus, how the Book of Job can speak or live as a model for them to be more resilient and to respond to this suffering in this world. So first of all, I would like to briefly talk about Dalit reception of the Book of Job. And there are a number of studies scholars have come out with. And one particular study that was a landmark study in the late 1990s is the work of Susai Manikam, Father Susai Manikam, a Catholic priest then. Then later he became a bishop, and he was the one who first looked at how a Dalit suffering can be seen in the light of the suffering of the Book of Job. Then, as I mentioned earlier, how the friends of Job torment him by questioning, by targeting him in terms of his morality, and how he must have committed a grave sin in the sight of God, and therefore God, he deserves the punishment, the sickness that he is going through at this moment as a part of his suffering in the life. And then Job was all the time, in disagreement with the three of his friends, and also with another friend, younger friend, who comes from chapter 37. That is, they are like speeches. And in all these, Job was always trying to defend his position and not agreeing with them, with their charges, and giving example after example how he was involved in the concern for the justice of the poor, and yet he was rewarded with this kind of sickness. So therefore his suffering, he will not agree that his suffering is due to his sin, that he is not responsible for any sins that he has committed in his lifetime. Rather, he was more concerned about the marginalized, and he was more concerned about the justice of God. So therefore, he was trying to refute all those charges that his friends were making in all the dialogue sections in the book of Job. In some of the works of the Indian parallels on Job, scholars have shown that the doctrine of karma is one of the leading concepts in which the book of Job has been widely used. And therefore, it is your karma, and therefore it is as it is mentioned in the book of Job, it is your karma. And then the other books also are compared with the book of Job, like Bhagavad Gita in the Hinduism, and also the story of Mahabali in in one particular tradition from Kerala. So all these stories were looked at as parallel stories from the Indian tradition. Especially the story of Mahabali portrays Mahabali as the one who is um, an exemplary figure of suffering, and therefore, in a similar way like Job, he was also considered to be a very important person. And one other story that is directly connected, the book of Job with the Indian within the Indian tradition, is the story of Harishchandra, and on whom the studies have been done. The story of Harishchandra is seen as an exact parallel to how a suffering, where the suffering leads, and what are the consequences of such a suffering that one individual goes through. and then staying as faithful, endure the suffering till the end. And therefore, Job is also seen in the same light as Harishchandra in the Hindu religious tradition. And therefore, these two stories are always compared. Now, Job also seen in the light of the caste system that that exists in India, along with the karma theory. And so, let me go a little more deeper into this idea. The caste and karma are the twin and the inseparable principles that impinge upon the Indian social system, which also makes the lives of the marginalized communities like Dalits the more vulnerable as their lives are made miserable due to this. Viewed in this perspective, the caste is a social evil that perpetuates along with the Hindu religious idea of karma theory, and therefore absolute that leads to absolute inequality among the human communities. Now, while the caste cannot be conceived as independent of a karma theory, according to this understanding, an ideological base in the form of karma. Hinduism maintains that one's birth is a particular in a particular caste is not arbitrary, but it is the result of the fruit of one's actions of the karma in that individual's previous birth. So the virtuous one who performed the good deeds will be born in a higher caste, whereas the wicked ones, on account of their bad deeds, will be born either as a Shudra or as a Dalit. Along with this, the Hinduism also reiterates the Varnashrama Dharma. So I do not want to get into all those details. Now, in the above light, what we can see here is the Dalit theological discourse stands against the evil of caste system and also the ideological base of the karma theory in order to exercise the demon, in order to so in order to cast out the caste based on which some religious traditions operate. While it is strongly argued that the caste system associated with the karma theory has got a religious sanction from the Hindu religion, some Hindu brands of Hindu religious tradition, based on the story of Job. This caste and karma theory is demythologized in order to help Dalits to come out of a religious and cultural oppression of caste system. And then it is in the final speeches in the book of Job, when God justifies the suffering and all that happened to Job, and then how he was the final judgment of God goes in favor of Job as against the friends. So there are a few things that we would like to conclude, sort of conclusion, and how the book of Job, the suffering is suffering has to be understood in a different way than what we normally understand. First, Job is seen as a symbolic representation of the pathos and the prototype of Dalits. As noted in the biblical text, Job was seated on the garbage heap outside the city, a poor man, a sick man, and a lonely, symbolizing the social death and ostracism. Now, Job is a type of the Dalits, the suffering, the people who majority of them are from the, whether Christians or non-Christian Dalits, they're all from the same, they are in the same background. And now he was also a non-Jew. So Job was considered to be with all the background. He was also considered to be a non-Jew, living outside the village in the midst of garbage heaps, affected by the sickness and the poverty, cut off from the rest of the community. Now, Job becomes the type of the Dalits as he shares in the sense of hopelessness that pervades the Dalit reality. Job's experience of abandonment by God, as Dalits experience the same. Now, Dalits experience God's forsakenness, so also the Job as we see in the entire book. Now, secondly, Job not only endures suffering, but he also protests. The protest of Job, I would call it him as a righteous dissenter. He is a hope for Dalits, in fact. Now, all along, as I mentioned earlier, Job was dissenting, not accepting the charges of his friends. And therefore, Job accused, even at times, Job accused God for a number of things. He accused God of oppressing him while he smiled on the schemes of the wicked. And then he had also accused him or attacked God in anger and shattered him in chapter 16, verse 9 and 12, and wronged him and counted him as an enemy, even 19:6 and 19:11. And then he whose justice, Job says, my justice has been denied by God, none other than God, and therefore God is considered to be my enemy. And he also was also maltreated by God in chapter 30, verse 19 to 21. Job also accused God for not fulfilling his duties as a ruler when he allowed a widow, when he helped a widow, the orphan, the poor, and so on. And therefore, it is all the time Job was refuting and protesting and even dissenting and even questioning the very justice of God with which the world is under operation. Then, thirdly, the faith of Job is resilient, both for the Dalit aspiration. It is helpful for both for the Dalit aspiration and hope. Even though Job suffers all kinds of social humiliation, yet he firmly believes in God and God's eventual redemptive power. Job even goes to the extent of trusting in God's redemption in the face of death by affirming the Redeemer, my Redeemer, by even say that my Redeemer lives. Even if I die, I will be resurrected. So that with that kind of strong hope, Dalits also live in this world. Then fourthly, the myth of the karma that is related with both the Job and also Dalits. This theory explodes in the end when the Job story ends with a kind of a moral boost, which is helpful for Dalits. The story ends with God's speech, Yahweh's speech, and thus indicates that it is God who has the last word, not Job's friends. God quashed Job's friends' accusation on Job that Job's deeds and consequences are the result of the present state. And God affirmed that Job has spoken well about God and that Job has been declared as right by the final arbiter, that is God. So therefore, the suffering concern that is looked in the book of Job is not just a kind of a moralistic view uh, of the traditional understanding of retribution. Rather, it is to be seen in terms of how Job comes out of this suffering, yet he suffers, he endures, but yet he will not accept the causes of suffering. And therefore, this is a unique contribution from the book of Job, especially for the marginalized communities like Dalits and others who may be experiencing the suffering at this time. And therefore, the book of Job stands as a very iconic symbol or iconic model, paradigm for the suffering that is understood in this manner. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Jesiratnam, for your beautiful and enlightening presentation regarding the suffering in the book according to the book of Job. And we know that the book of Job has a very important message on the theme of suffering. And it's a great literary work also. According to Martin Luther, it was the most excellent Bible book. And thank you, Professor Jesiratnam, that you have presented the question of suffering according to the book of Job in the context of Indian social system. And now I invite our participants to have, if you have any questions or any interventions to complement to the to this session on the book of Job and suffering, please put forward through your through the reactions in the dialog box. If you put forward, and we can I can invite you for the questions. Please, if anyone has any questions, please put forward. Somebody, Father Matthew, if you please unmute. Please unmute.
Yes, thank you very much, Reverend Professor Dr. Yesiratnam. You have connected really the suffering of Job with that of the Indian human experiences. I think that is something extraordinary, and I think this is the way we need to understand the Bible with the text and the context. So my question will be that you also bring in karma. So according to the karma, you have to undergo the suffering, and you are entitled to undergo the suffering because of your past life. So does anything there, or will you be able to interpret in such a way that this karma which you have acquired from the past life, will it be possible that we can change?
Okay. Yeah, the basic idea of karma is that you cannot change anything. You cannot, because that is your karma. And that is how the religious scriptures in Hinduism, some brand of Hinduism, I don't say the overall Hinduism, some brands of Hinduism emphasize and also sort of force psychologically, they also force on Dalits and other marginalized communities to say that it is also against the religious system. You cannot change karma. Suppose you are allotted with some kind of a job, and then the vacation, the sort of vocation that you are given this kind of job, and you have no right to change it. You are entitled for that, and you are supposed to continue with that as long as your life comes to an end. Perhaps what you can do is you behave in a better manner this life. Then probably your karma, because of that good karma that you are involved in, probably you may be born in a better way, the next generation, next life. So that is how they try to suppress the suffering. The protest. They try to make people to be submissive and no rebellion. And so therefore the status quo will be maintained all the time. So that is what. So nobody has the right to change the karma because it's a religiously sanctioned, divinely sanctioned. So that's what that made Dalits and other marginalized people, communities, to continuously suffer and without any protest or without any rebellion and without any questioning whatsoever. Thank you.
So I don't see anyone, any more question. So I think
No,
we will.
it's a difficult
Please.
topic, and you
Yeah.
have to grapple with it. So
Yeah.
it's not not necessary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Brother Jarian, I have a question.
But
Yes, yes.
yeah, you have a question. Okay, please.
Yes, thank you for your wonderful talk, Jesiratram.
Yes.
So I was wondering, in the book of Job, there's a discussion of karma related. Did Job believe in past lives, in past and future lives? My question. Did Job, in the book of Job, did Job believe that there's a life before that present one?
No, Job did not believe in all this. What we are looking here is how the suffering of some communities is justified based on the Indian, some brands of Hinduism or the Indian religious systems. And therefore, Book of Job comes as a rescue, in fact. It's a kind of aid for such communities to refute. I don't think Job was aware of karma, but then certainly it is a kind of retribution. Retribution theory or retribution in practice was there in the Old Testament. The doctrine of retribution was already there in the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm.
So, sort of retribution and karma can be equated, though they are not the same. They come from different social contexts, socio-political, religious contexts. But certainly, there can be some coincidence between them. So, in that light, we are talking about how the retribution, in a normal sense, that based on which Job was accused, was refuted by him. And so, same way how Dalits and others can survive or sort of come out clearly and defend their stand against the karma.
I'm Anthony here. So, I'm Anthony here. You have mentioned the karmas. In the beginning of the book of Job, it is mentioned that Job prays to God regarding the actions of his children, so that he can avoid curses. So can we equate the Jewish customs of curses to karmas? Because curses is once again a compilation of all the sins of the person, of their forefathers, and their the generations together. So doesn't this sort of equate the karmas? Because even karma is a similar a compilation of sins gathered through the generations. So I believe there is a similarity in this, and not only that, Job, to overcome these curses, the karmas, he prays to God for forgiveness. So he does all the other sacrifices, like the sin sacrifices and all that. My question is, why can't the Dalits also adopt, instead of them being totally abandoned, they can also do a similar sort of sacrifices, so that the karmic, in karmic law, they can go to the better pastures. So this is my view.
Yeah, probably right. You are right, and especially the whole sacrificial system is based on it's a kind of remission, restitution of the sins. Yeah, possibilities. Yeah, you are right. There may be a lot of parallels in that sense. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Jesiratnam. And I think Minimore Matthew has a question. Please, in brief. And after
Yes.
that, please.
Dr. Jesiratnam, thank you for your good exposition. I have one thing to ask for clarity, that in the book of Job, we find that he had faith, and he has been keeping his faith along with his hope till the end. How do you connect that faith in God with the karma theory? Because karma comes from the doctrine of Varnashrama Dharma and Karma Sansara in the Hindu tradition. But how do you connect faith in God, which the book of Job very clearly says, to the doctrine of karma as you exposit it today?
Yeah. So the faith in God, okay, that is the basis on which the entire book works. But then it's not just faith. Just because I have faith in God, like Job, then of course I suffer. But then the friends of Job sort of disturbed him by saying that perhaps your faith is not strong enough. Perhaps in your faith there are breaches. There are a lot of gaps, and therefore you need to confess that you are a sinner. So that kind of moralistic view of faith is refuted. That's my argument. It's not that having faith in God and then making it as a kind of moralistic outlook, in the light of a moralistic outlook, certain do's and don'ts. This is what is, if that is what is faith, then that is dangerous, because Job has done enough good works, good things, and he was all the time, as just now someone said, was trying to please God, and there was no mistake in him. Even God has not pointed out anything wrong in him. But that is not true. That's faith is something more deeper, and how you talk about the justice of God, how God deals with the communities, and how God acts in a much more deeper manner. That's what Job is exposing. At times, God also is not really, though he was very faithful to God, his faithfulness was not rewarded. That's what he is questioning, and that's what he is sort of raising objections to. And first hand to the friends, and then secondly, he was also a little bit worried about how God, perhaps there was a whole skewed social systems that we need to also look at it. So faith not just to be seen in terms of religious moralism, but rather it is something more deeper and more wider in understanding. So that's what I'm trying to understand from the book of Job. But you are right that faith, but then how do you define faith in the book of Job is a matter of debate that we can go on. Thank you.
Thank you. I must say sorry that we have to proceed to the next talk by Venerable Tenzin. And thank you, Professor Dr. Jesiratnam, for your wonderful presentation on the book of Job, special focus on the question of suffering. And we know that suffering is the hardest problem to understand, and it remains so. And we are always in search of this understanding the question of suffering in the world, especially in the present context of present scenario of this pandemic COVID-19. And now we have an eminent scholar and speaker on Venerable Tenzin Lexok, who speaks on suffering, what compels us to practice. And really, as I read the title of the presentation of Venerable Tenzin, I was excited, and to say that the title is very exciting. And also, I think he will be able to excite us further. Venerable Tenzin is a Buddhist monk in the 17th year of the Geshe Studies program at Serajay Monastic University in Karnataka, that is Bailakuppa, Mysore, I think. Yeah.
Yes.
And he studies classic Indian Buddhist treatises and their Tibetan commentaries in the tradition of ancient Nalanda University. He was ordained by His Holiness the Dalai Lama in 2001, and Venerable Tenzin, born in Virginia, United States of America in 1973, and he obtained a Bachelor of Arts in 1995. The question, what makes for the most happy and meaningful life, which compelled him to major in philosophy during college, gradually led to his study of meditation and philosophy with teachers among the exiled Tibetan communities in India and Nepal from 1999 until the present. And for the past 10 years, he has tried to make basic Buddhist teachings accessible to various audiences in India and the United States through lectures, essays, and meditation instruction. And we are very happy to have you with us, Venerable Tenzin Letsok, and I heartfully welcome you and invite you for the next presentation. And for our participants, we have 30 minutes presentation from the speaker, and afterwards, when you have questions, is always for us to notify your intervention or your question. Please in the chat box give a sign through reactions or through a note. Then we can better notify your question or your intervention. Please. Thank you, and I welcome Venerable Tenzin for the talk.
Okay. Thank you, Father Charan, for the warm welcome, and thank you to Father Matthew and the Ecumenical Christian Center for organizing this conference and the conference last week. So I'm very happy to be here with all of you Christian brothers and sisters and other Buddhist brothers and sisters who are here. So, I mean, the reason we're holding this conference over Zoom and not live is because we're in the middle of a global pandemic. And since we're all, I mean, as Buddhists and Christians, we're all, I mean, brothers and sisters in religious practice and practicing our own religious traditions. So as I think, I mean, one unique thing we share in common as religious practitioners is that we approach problems with faith in what we perceive as what we believe to be most divine, and that we, one of the unique ways we have to work towards the resolution of problems is through prayer, using our minds to generate positive intention in the world, to supplicate the blessing of those who are more powerful than us, more powerful beings such as God or Buddha, enlightened beings. So I'd like to invite you all, as at the beginning of my talk, to just pause for a moment of silence to pray for all those who are suffering in the world. Especially those who, in the midst of this pandemic, suffering. I think most of us are very fortunate in comparison to many who are more impoverished and more oppressed than us. So yeah, so let's pause for a moment of prayer together. Yeah, just silent prayer. Okay, thank you. So I hope that through our own efforts, mortal efforts, and the intervention of more spiritually developed beings than us, that this pandemic and other sufferings of the world can quickly be relieved. So yeah, so my talk today, Suffering, What Compels Us to Practice, is the title is kind of an initial, when Father Matthew asked me to speak about suffering in the Buddhist and in the Christian tradition. This is kind of what first occurred to me. So I came up with four outlines, or four headings. Maybe I'll share my screen if I can. I'm sure I can. Yeah, you can see my outline just a little bit. Let's see how this. Yeah. So I have 4 headings. First of all, if there's no suffering, then there is no spiritual practice. So I mean, the whole point of having religions and spiritual practice is a reaction to suffering, I believe. Then the second is, well, why do we suffer? What is the reason that we experience suffering? The third, how to reduce and eliminate suffering in the world. And then the fourth, some other shared values that I think we Christians and Buddhists have. So the whole point of my talk really is, I was thinking, I joined the conference session last week and listened to the excellent speakers, and it just got me thinking about, well, what are some of the fundamental beliefs that we have in common as Christians and Buddhists, and especially with regard to the way we approach suffering. So this is, yeah, so I haven't made it I've tried not to make it Buddhist specific, and I haven't included quotes from Buddhist scripture and things. I've tried to make it quite general in a way that, presenting different points in a way that I think apply to us in common. So the first heading, if there's no suffering, then there's no practice. So yeah, again, I think the practice of our faiths, whether the Christianity or Buddhism or Islam or Hinduism or Judaism, is a reaction to our human predicament of having suffering, dissatisfaction, pain, problems, sickness, ultimately death, and wondering and seeing that just through material development, through resources, increasing our material well-being, wealth, and having better food, better shelter, better clothing, better medicines, that those things alone, they don't seem to have the ability to ultimately eliminate our suffering. So in a personal way, then how does suffering compel us to practice? One way is that through personal crisis and confusion causes us to question basic assumptions about the meaning of life and what is most important, and to seek alternative answers. I know among serious religious practitioners, many, I think you can see in the Gospels, also in the Buddhist scriptures, many people, they turn to devote their life to spiritual practice because of some death of someone near to them, a parent, or a brush with death themselves, or a bout with depression, or some other crisis in their life, and it turns them. Especially even in the midst of great affluence, wealth, and worldly success, when people still they face severe suffering, then they turn towards the spiritual path. Another is that personal emotional pain causes us to seek relief, not by material possessions. And then our own suffering humbles us. So one essential quality we try to develop on the spiritual path is to develop humility. So oftentimes, especially where we've had a lot of worldly success, we can easily have arrogance and think that we're better than other people. But then, when we become very ill, someone close to us dies, or suddenly, say, our business collapses, like it's probably happening to many people now during the pandemic, then we realize we're not so much in control of our lives as we thought we were, and we're humbled. And then we realize that we need to turn to maybe something, we need to find a different source of well-being and happiness and meaning in our life than just material success or kind of typical worldly success. So that's another way suffering benefits us, actually. And then finally, our own personal suffering opens our hearts to the plight of others. So often, like, we probably all had the experience of being really healthy for a long time and just kind of being self-absorbed in our own good health, our own enjoyment of life, and then suddenly get struck down with with sickness, with a fever or stomach, food poisoning, stomach pain, or cancer or something. And then suddenly it dawns upon us that, in the midst of, at the same time as we're feeling so fortunate and just enjoying life, many other people were suffering in this very way that I am now suffering, right? So our own personal suffering also opens our hearts and reminds us of the plight of others, and then it opens the door to us generating compassion for others. So then, looking at the suffering of others, so seeing others suffering stirs our humanity and our compassion, and reminds us how, so not only our own suffering can awaken compassion in us, when we see the suffering of others, like recently, I mean, not now so much, but like a month ago or more, we all saw so many migrant workers, leaving the major cities in India, walking, making their way back home. And we really, we can empathize when we see the images of these people, and we and other people we see in hospitals, emergency rooms, or frontline workers, medical workers who every day are working around people infected with the coronavirus, and then they're afraid that when they go home, they infect their families, not to mention so many people out of work and so forth. So when we see the suffering of others, it also awakens compassion in us. Which, when we have real, sincere compassion for others, of course, we feel a degree of their pain, but we also, being an extremely positive quality, it brings a certain kind of joy as well to commiserate with the suffering of others. And then other suffering helps us to be less self-pity. So when we see the suffering of others, it reminds us that actually we're so fortunate in many ways. If we never think about others, then our own problems seem like a huge deal, sometimes an insurmountable kind of challenge, and we can easily generate self-pity and just feel sorry for ourselves. Whereas when we see the suffering of others, it reminds us that, the difficulty and suffering is a shared human experience, and compared to so many other people in the world, our suffering is like nothing. It's very minor. So it can help us to overcome self-pity. And then finally, looking at the suffering of others helps to bolster our own resolve to use our life in a meaningful way. It can remind us of what's really meaningful in life, and that, especially when we recognize that everything that we have, all of our material possessions, all of our education, all of our prosperity and wealth, and all of our joy that comes about through, relationships with our family and friends, all of that comes about in dependence upon others. And so many of the systems that sustain our very life, like food systems, electricity, roads and transportation, water, all of that is provided for us by people who are strangers to us, people who we don't know. So then when we remember how much of our well-being comes about in dependence upon strangers, and then we see strangers suffering, then it reminds us that we have a responsibility to use our lives in a way to benefit others, not just in a selfish way. So then the next major heading is, why do we suffer? So why do we experience suffering, ourselves and others? And I think one fundamental assertion that I think, we Christians and Buddhists, and maybe in any other religious tradition as well, I think we can agree on, is that we suffer because fundamentally we live in disharmony with reality, with the truth of the way things are, right? So of course, if we start to discuss about, well, what is the ultimate reality of things, we're going to disagree. We'll have philosophical disagreements, and that's fine. We each have a right to interpret, why things happen. What are the mysteries of the world, to give different narratives, different stories for explaining those. But I think it's important to note or to see that we have a shared belief that the reason we suffer is because there's a disharmony, a discord between the way the world really is, whether it's created by God or whether suffering arises because of non-virtuous karma or because of harming others. Whatever the explanation is, that we have a misperception and ignorance about the truth of the ultimate truth of the world, and therefore we don't live in accordance with it. We live in disharmony with it. And it's due to that kind of discord between the way we're leading our life and the way the world actually is that it creates this friction or suffering. Then the second point there, due to exaggerating, I think, so again, some points I think we can share as Christians and Buddhists, due to exaggerating our independence or our separateness from others, right? And due to forgetting our dependence upon others. So I think we exaggerate our sense of an independent, sovereign, self-governing or self-sustaining person, So I think in the Christian context, we exaggerate our independence from God, our not depending upon, the love of God and the kindness of God and of others, of our brothers and sisters. In the Buddhist context, we speak about it more in terms of we exaggerate our independence from others, that we think our life doesn't depend upon others, but everything good comes about through my own hard work, alone. And then, so we exaggerate our independence and separate from others and forget our dependence. And then because of that, then we become selfish and self-centered and egoistic. So then due to selfishness, being self-absorbed, self-centered, then we become disconnected from what is divine. I mean, in one way we can agree that what's most divine in the world is our interdependence, our interconnectedness with other human beings, with other creatures, with the natural environment, and then with, the supreme wisdom of our objects of refuge, whether it be God or Buddha, the supreme love and wisdom of beings who are much more highly developed than us and are our refuge, our guide, our teachers. So we become disconnected from that when we grasp at this kind of independent self. We become disconnected from our fellow human beings, and we feel like we're in competition with them rather than seeing ourselves as something that should cooperate with them. And we become disconnected from animals and other sentient beings, and then we become disconnected from the natural environment. I think, as religious, practitioners, we have a pivotal role to play now in the world in trying to help people see a way to alleviate this huge problem of global warming, pollution, and climate destruction. Because we each, in the way we view the world, we have a unique way of reminding people how we are dependent upon upon the earth and the water and the land that are given to us, and how unique, privileged we are to share, to be able to use the natural world, and that what a tragedy it would be to destroy it. And then finally, I mean, the most direct cause of our own suffering, I think, is harming others. Well, I mean, in the Christian tradition, you say we reap what we sow. So by harming others, then it's a sin, and we ourselves are harmed. In the Buddhist tradition, it's just the same. If we create, but we explain in terms of karma. So of course, the Buddhist explanation of how karma works is quite different than I think some of the Hindu schools where it's a fixed thing. In the Buddhist explanation of karma, it's very it's something that's very changeable depending upon one's own actions, even within one life. But fundamentally, I think we can agree that we create the causes of suffering for ourselves by killing, stealing, lying, by treating others in a way that we ourselves would not want to be treated. So then how do we reduce and eliminate suffering? Let's check my time here. Okay. So how do we reduce and eliminate suffering? So again, I'm trying to present it in a way that I think we can agree upon, is that we seek, by seeking the ultimate truth of the way things are and following in the footsteps of those who reveal it, right? So as a Buddhist, then we seek, we feel that Buddha perceived a fundamental and very subtle truth about the way the world is, and then he led his life in such a way that it's an example for us, to follow this by not harming others and benefiting others as much as we can. And I think, Jesus' life is very similar. He revealed to us, truth of the way of the message of God, and then through his own life example, showed how to live according to that, right? So basically, yeah, I think our religious practice is about trying to understand the fundamental truth about the world with the help of divine teachers, inspired teachers, and then follow in their footsteps. And then also by recognizing our dependence on and our interconnectedness with others, right? So by recognizing how our very lives, from our physical existence to our mental well-being to ultimately our liberation from suffering, that our redemption, it depends upon, it's something we cannot achieve alone as a single person in isolation from other people. It depends upon our relationships, not only to the divine, but also to our own brothers and sisters in our practice who support us in different ways. And not only those of our own faith, but in relation to all sentient beings, right? So, I mean, in a way, I mean, one of the very basis of our spiritual practice is practicing pure morality, not harming others, and using our life to try to benefit others. Without others, we cannot do that, right? That depends upon others. And then finally, how to reduce and eliminate suffering in the world by devoting ourselves, to working for the welfare of all sentient beings to the best of our ability, which means by not harming and by helping, not harming others and helping them as much as we can. So I think that's something we all agree on. Okay, so within my time limit, I've gotten through the three main points. So now just a few, the kind of miscellaneous things that I think also are shared values that we have as Buddhists and Christians. One is, the first is that altruism is more important than consumerism, right? So I think as spiritual practitioners, we agree that, I mean, so much of the world today, so much human activity in the world today is devoted to consumption of goods, right? Because people need to make, they need to make a material living, they need to have shelter and food and clothing, so they need money. In order to make money, they need to sell things, right? So in order to sell things, they need to convince people that they have to buy things. And advertising is such a powerful force, today, especially the last 100 years, more than it ever has been before, I think, in the history of humanity. And I think there's a big danger that because the messages put out by advertisers, we're just trying to convince people to buy things. It is what do you say? It's almost like overwhelming and basically it's like a very loud noise that's drowning out the message of the spiritual traditions about how to find real happiness. So I think there's a real danger that these days that many people believe, and it's probably not something that didn't exist in the past, but many people are convinced, if they don't think deeply, that they can really have happiness by just having, better snacks and better clothes and having more money and living in, a more expensive apartment building and going to, more lavish restaurants, that will ultimately bring real satisfaction. Whereas I think, I mean, obviously that's not true, but of course it takes a little experience to see that. So I think in our spiritual traditions, we share that, altruism, using our life to benefit others, to work for the welfare of others, is a much more fundamental and a source of a much kind of deeper satisfaction and happiness than can ever be attained through consumerism. So yeah, increased prosperity does not bring increased happiness. Of course, to a certain level, if people don't have enough to eat, they don't have proper medical care, they don't have education, they are going to be more unhappy than people who have those things. There's no question. But material development can only take people so far. So in that way, then both Jesus and Buddha, they also prescribed for their followers a life of simplicity to find happiness. So that I think is a message that we can work together to share with people in the world. Because I mean, ultimately, I mean, these issues are all related, isn't it? That it's almost like because we don't appreciate simplicity, that 7 billion people in the world, we're striving for more and more luxurious kind of standard of living and using up more and more finite resources on the earth And if we keep going at the pace we are, we'll quickly destroy, the very basis for our life, our physical life, and our spiritual life, right? So, okay. So just a couple more points. So then our increased positive human values is much more important than increasing human development. So wisdom, increasing wisdom and compassion is going to be a better source of well-being and happiness than increasing our affluence and material well-being. And then economic cooperation is more important than economic competition. So I think this is another thing that we see, that capitalism has become the dominant kind of economic system around so much of the world. And it's really interesting to see how the pandemic highlights the differences, between, like, I'm from the United States, and you see it's one of the most extreme, like, capitalist economic systems in the world. And you see how it leaves so many people really uncared for fundamentally. Whereas you look at a very communist country like China, which of course has its drawbacks in terms of being authoritarian, but even I think India, the way capitalism has been shaped in India, does a much better job in ways, although, yeah, maybe I'm sticking my neck out there, than at looking after the less fortunate, right? So I think as spiritual practitioners in our respective spiritual traditions, we have a responsibility also to say, like, look, it's not okay that some people become extremely wealthy while other people are left in extreme poverty. We have, a responsibility to others in our human family, that we look after everyone and make sure everyone has the opportunity to have a meaningful livelihood through their own work where they can. And then finally, again, the issue of the environment. I mean, I think the environmental crisis that we're living in is like I mean, of course, the pandemic is a more pressing immediate problem, but probably 3-4 years from now, this will be over. Once the pandemic is over, then still we have, all the destruction of the oceans, pollution of the air, more and more natural disasters, typhoons, and then of course, as the environment changes, there'll be more drought, more floods. So I think as religious traditions, if we don't have a constructive way to help people find resolutions to these problems, and we don't stand up, against the fossil fuel companies and other powerful forces that want to keep the status quo and keep society going, human society going in a way that's just destroying the environment, then people will feel like we're irrelevant in the world. So I think, based on our religious beliefs, we cherish the natural environment that's been given to us, and we cherish the well-being of the less fortunate, who are going to be most affected by climate destruction, and we see the drawbacks of just runaway material development. So I think we really have something meaningful and powerful to say to the whole global crisis. And if we don't speak up, then again, people will feel like these religious traditions are irrelevant. They're not really stepping up to the plate at a time when we need it most. So so that's all I have to say. So thank you very much for having me again, and I hope there's some benefit. If not, then sorry to waste your time. But thank you to all the speakers and the organizers again.
Thank you, Venerable Tenzin, for your wonderful talk and inspiring words. And naturally, you have given different ways to overcome actually the question of suffering in this world generally. And speaking different human values, altruism versus consumerism, economic cooperation against competition, and environmental restoration, and so on. These are very important values which we have to regain, I think. And thank you very much. And a big applause to both Venerable Tenzin and Reverend Dr. Professor Jesiratnam for the both of them. Big thanks and applause. We will give a applause like waving our hands. Okay, now I invite the participants for your interventions or questions. And first of all, we have a Most Reverend Rafi Manjali among us, and may I ask your grace to make an intervention and complement what we are discussing with your ideas. And Reverend Most Reverend Dr. Rafi Manjali is at present the Bishop of Allahabad or Prayagraj, and since 2013 he is Bishop of Allahabad, and earlier in 2007 he was ordained as Bishop of Varanasi, and we know both these cities, Varanasi and Allahabad, both are two important religious centers of India. And Most Reverend Rafi Manjali has a doctorate in spirituality from the University of Angelicum, if I am not wrong, in Rome. Yeah, and he's one of the member bishops of our Kiviniswan Dialogue Commission or Office of Catholic Bishop Conference of India, and he's very much engaged, interested in dialogue. And please, Most Reverend Rafi Manjali, please make a few words of intervention. Please unmute your phone, please. Okay.
Thank you, Father Cherian. First of all, my hearty congratulations to the organizers, Ecumenical Christian Center, represented mainly by Father Matthew and all his collaborators, and also you yourself, Father Cherian, representing CBCI desk for dialogue and ecumenism. So my hearty congratulations. I would like to also appreciate and congratulate both these experts, Professor Jesuratnam and Venerable Tenzin, for shedding so much light on suffering from both Christian perspective and also the Buddhist perspective. I liked the presentation of Jesuratnam. Of course, it's an ocean of a topic, and within this limited time, he couldn't do justice to all the aspects. But however, he has touched upon all the important aspects. I think he gave us, first of all, he said the book of Job, because suffering is so universal, the book of Job has found its place in all religions, particularly Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and the different churches of Christians. So I think that was something nice. And then he went on to the contemporary. He gave a little bit of a history of interpretation and how Job is a representation. I mean, how different people presented Job as a model of patience, patient suffering, endurance, a model for faith, a model for hope, and so on. And then he came to the contemporary interpretations of the book of Job and contextualizing of this personality of Job. I liked the way he put Job as a kind of dissenter, someone who is breaking the traditional mold and traditional understanding, because the traditional teaching was that God rewards the just and punishes the wicked. Now here is the situation, innocent people suffering, and I think many writers have taken up this question of innocent persons suffering, how to understand it. And book of Job is one of the attempts to deal with, one of the early attempts to deal with the suffering of the innocent. And also it sheds light on the fact of suffering and also the person of God. God is God. We should not presume to what you call fit God into a kind of straitjacket. We cannot impose our own ideas onto God. or we cannot put our own morality or our own understanding of reality onto God. The reality is much bigger than we can comprehend. So I think that particular aspect comes in here. Am I audible? Are you able to hear? Are you able to hear?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's
So
working.
I think, and I liked the Dalit perspective that he gave. I think every scripture need to be made relevant for the present generation of people, and particularly, I think every scripture has something to say to every community, and the Dalits are suffering, and I think Jesu Ratnam and all those people who contextualized the book of Job, applied it to their situation, and found hope and positive energy from this book. I think they did well. So congratulations to Jesu Ratnam for his presentation, and Venerable Tenzin. I think his entire presentation was hanging on 4 pegs. He talked about the reality of suffering, inevitability of suffering, and he talked in general about the blessings that suffering can bring in. Suffering is a great teacher, and there are blessings that we can receive from suffering. And he mentioned some of them. I don't want to go into the detail for a short of time. And then he dealt with the cause of suffering, which of course in Buddhist parlance, it is ignorance or desire, whatever it is. But he said, we cause, whatever it is, we are the cause of suffering. And the Buddhist would say, if we are the cause, then we can also find the antidote, or we can find we have within ourselves the antidote for suffering, or for the removal of suffering, knowledge of reality and things like that. But I liked the way he presented. He did not present it purely from the Buddhist perspective, but he sort of intermingled. He took a wider perspective, Buddhist Christian perspective, and that was very good. How to eliminate suffering, and some of the universal values that we must practice. And I must say that I was very much impressed that he focused or emphasized, aligned the fact that we are not monads, we are not islands, but we are all interconnected. The whole universe, the visible, invisible, the living, the inanimate, everything is interconnected. And whatever happens to one particular unit somehow affects all of us. And it is in the interest of all of us that we help one another, we move out, we become altruistic, we become other-centered, and we need to, there should be a kind of dilation of heart. Our heart should keep on growing in order to embrace everyone. And that's one way of getting out of the miserable little world and kind of self-engrossed and self-inflicted suffering. Suffering is there, but then it is the way we understand it, the way we take it, that it makes it, let's say, worthwhile or unpleasant or painful, or let us say a learning experience. So once again, congratulations to the organizers, and congratulations and appreciation to both these learned speakers and all the participants. Let us move from strength to strength, and let us build on these small foundations, this little good effort. I pray that this may make us better human beings, more sensitive, more compassionate, and more proactive, and more generous people, to alleviate. All of us can do something to make the life of others better. All of us can do something towards the alleviation and removal of suffering of the other. We can contribute for the well-being of humanity and the whole universe. So that is, with those little remarks, general remarks, goodbye, and thank you very much. and let's continue. Let's make this world and this universe better.
Thank
Okay.
you, Your Grace, for your wonderful intervention. Thank you very much. I see there are two questions towards Venerable Tenzin. First of all, Minimal Matthew, and secondly, Reverend Prasad Matthew. And I ask Minimal to put forward your intervention and your question. Please, Minimal, please unmute your phone. Yeah, please.
Thank you. Hello.
Yeah.
Am I audible?
Yeah. Please.
Reverend Tenzin, let's talk. Thank you for your inspiring talk. And my question is, you have mentioned about human being, if they are selfish or self-absorbed or self-centered, they are disconnected from the divine with the environment, everything. But in the present scenario, we find people who are selfish or who are self-centered. They are going to the temple, church, or mosque, to the religious centers. Are they disconnected from the divine? What do you say about it?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Thank you, Minimal. Minimal. Yeah. So you're saying, let me repeat your question to make sure I've got it right. So you're saying in the present situation, we find many people going to the church or the temple, but they seem quite self-centered. So are they disconnected from the divine?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think so. I mean, it's not a black and white thing where either we are connected with the divine or we're disconnected from it, right? There's shades of gray, from being totally disconnected to being a little connected or more connected, or to totally immersing ourselves in the divine, right? So, I mean, I definitely think, in people, and also our connection with other people, it's hard to find anyone who's totally disconnected from anyone else, right? We naturally have connection with our mother and father, our siblings, our friends. We all have connections with some people, right? And so I think the more we have, real wholesome relationships with other people, whether it be our family or friends, or whether it be, beyond that, our neighbors or even strangers, or even if we can generate, love and affection for the people we most dislike, the people we find we're most different from, we have the most difficulty with. I think the more we generate love and compassion for others, whoever they be, the more we connect with the divine, right? So I think that's why you see in the mystics of every religious tradition, they have this radical, selfless love for all creatures, whoever they are.
So thank you, Reverend Prasad Matthew. Please, your question,
Yeah.
and then Deva after.
Thank you, Father. I have put my question in the dialogue box. Actually, thank you very much, Venerable Tenzin, for your talk. As I understand, you have said about what and why of suffering, then how to overcome suffering, then some shared values as we all human beings share. Yes, I agree with you. Suffering makes us responsible and compels us to be responsible in our life. But my question is it necessary to suffer to become responsible, or should we wait till we suffer in order to become responsible? So that is something, the responsibility must come as we are human beings, as we are created by God, as we are fellow creatures in this world along with other human beings and other creatures. Why we have to wait till we suffer and in a bad way to become responsible? Why that human destiny like that?
Okay, yeah, thank you for your question, Father. Yeah, sorry, I did type in a reply. I just sent it as you began to speak. It took me some time to type it and then figure out how to send it. But I'll also just say something now in reply. Well, I mean, I agree with you that we shouldn't wait. No, we shouldn't wait until we face some massive tragedy, in order to use our lives in a way that's beneficial to others. Just by the very fact that our lives depend upon others, beginning with our parents from the time of, conception and birth, and when we are an infant, our entire well-being depends upon our parents, and then, by extension, upon their parents, our grandparents, and so forth, on back. But I mean, I guess I think it's also important to recognize that, I mean, in our experience, we have suffering, we have problems, we have dissatisfaction from the very beginning of our lives. So, what it would be, to be without suffering is almost a moot point. But if we could imagine, a world where there is no sickness, there's no sadness, there's no hardship, then I think in that kind of world, it would be difficult for people to, there wouldn't be any problems for them to overcome. There wouldn't be any, suffering for them to try to work to reduce. So who would they help? It wouldn't occur to them to use their life to work for the benefit of others, because everybody has everything they need already. So in that way, I think it's because we experience suffering, then we realize how important it is to use our lives to try to overcome that. Right? For ourselves and for others.
So thank you.
Thank you.
Over to Mr. Deva, please.
Thank you, Venerable Tenzin, for your presentation. My question is with regard to why people suffer. And you had few points said that people suffer because they are disconnected from God, they are disconnected from people, and so on. But my question comes from an Indian context and from a Dalit context, where Dalits are kept distant from God, and because of their caste system, they are kept distant from people, and that is how their suffering is. And suffering is something which is very audible in the lives of Dalits. And when already they are suffering, instead of addressing their context or instead of seeing the cause, how legitimate it would be to say that you suffer because you are disconnected from God. Now, my problem is when you say, you suffer because you are disconnected from God, I feel that we make God some, I think I get a image like God is a sadist. Now, if God is a sadist, do I need such God? Just because I don't have a relationship with him, no, he allows suffering on me or I suffer. Do I need such God? Is my question. My second question is, now being in the context of pandemic, there are many people who are suffering. People who are connected with God or people who are in God, do they not suffer? If they suffer, then what is the reason for their suffering? And my third question is, you said, there were a lot of points that you said that, the cessation of suffering, how to stop the suffering. And you said, you have to help people, you have to, you have to help people selflessly. But again, thinking from a Dalit context, I mean, the entire life of a Dalit is serving the society. The entire life of a Dalit is serving the people and serving the society. So what would be the right suggestion in an Indian context to give to people to stop the suffering? So these are my questions. Thank you, sir.
Can you repeat the last part, the last thing you said? What would be the right?
What would be the right? No, we said, if you serve the society, then I think that is the way to cease the suffering.
If you serve, I was saying that. Yeah, if you serve society, you serve.
Yeah, you said that. So my thing is, like Dalits, the whole life, the entire life, they've been serving the society, and their suffering doesn't cease. Can there be an alternative, a suggestion for the cessation of suffering?
But is there service to society? Is it voluntary, or it's like it's part of a system of oppression?
It is imposed. It is imposed.
Yeah, see, that's different than what I'm talking about. I wasn't talking about, serving when we're serving others because we're being forced to, that's slavery. I mean, that's not like a selfless service that I was talking about. That's something very different. But hold on, shall we go back to the first question? Because I'm not sure I fully understood your first question. I think you were saying that I was saying that suffering comes about from our separation from the divine, right? Because there's a divine truth of the way the world is, and that we misunderstand that, we're separated from that, and thereby we suffer. And then I think you're asking, well, how? But in an Indian context, as a Dalit, we by our very birth, we're born into a suffering situation, and then you're telling us that that's our fault because we're disconnected from the divine. How can that be? Is that correct? Prasad, yeah, I can't see now. Is that correct? Is that your question, Deva?
Eva?
Yeah, my question is, when we say that no, they suffer because they are disconnected from divine, do we need such divine or do we need such God? Because we make God, or we really bring down the power and the purpose of God, and we give a different image to the people who are suffering because they are suffering. Somehow, when we make it, when we give it a divine color, we actually escape from the context and we somehow legitimize their suffering. That is what I feel.
Right. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to do that in any way. And I'm not so familiar with the situation of the Dalit people in India. But I think maybe if I can clarify, like, I know in the Christian tradition, one of the main teachings of God is the 10 Commandments given to Moses, right? That you should not kill, you should not steal, you should not lie, you should not worship false gods, and so forth, right? So that's a clear, that's clearly the intention of that's like the advice of God for his followers, is to not kill, not steal, not lie, not to harm others. So, in a way, I think, to me, it seems like God is telling you, like, look, if you kill others, if you steal from others, if you harm others, then you will suffer. That is the truth of the way the world is. And also in last week's conference, Father Joy was saying that I was curious to see how he would explain suffering from a Christian perspective. And to me, it seemed like what he was saying is it boils down to sin. We don't suffer because God intended us to do that, because God is, the perfection of love. So it's not that God intends people to suffer, but it's due to our own human sin that we suffer. That seems to be that's the Christian kind of explanation of how we suffer. So I was just trying to point out that, yeah, in Buddhism, it's the same. That the Buddhist fundamental teaching is to abandon the 10 non-virtuous actions, right? Of which the first is killing, the second is stealing, the third is adultery, and so forth. They're very similar. It's a very similar code of morality. So it's that kind of, when I'm talking about the divine truth, I guess basically I'm talking about that this advice from God or this advice from Buddha, that basically we should abandon harming other sentient beings. So then, it is the hard truth, I think, for us. When we ourselves suffer sickness or poverty or oppression, that then we have to ask ourselves, well, did I do something to create, to create the cause for this suffering experience that I have now? To me, that's one of the most difficult things to swallow in the Buddhist teachings. But that's as a Buddhist, I believe that's what the Buddha taught, right? But of course, when I look at this life now, I didn't do anything very bad to other people. Of course, I get angry, I've stolen, lied a little bit, I've done little bad things. But like, I had cancer when I was 25. So when I was 25, I was diagnosed with cancer. And then I thought, well, what have I done to deserve this? So yeah, I think that is one of the big questions in life. Why do good people suffer? What have they done? Especially if you look at children who are born with birth defects, and they might die at a very young age, or they, born with autism, very debilitating diseases. What have they done in that life to deserve them? that's a big challenge for, you know, for any religious tradition, for anyone to explain. So I don't know. I mean, yeah. I mean, why is someone born as a Dalit? You know, of course, it's you don't want to blame the person, and in that life, you definitely, of course, you don't blame the child that's born into a, you know, Dalit family. They haven't done anything to deserve being in that situation. There's no question about that. But then, how do we explain, you know, one person being born into a Dalit family and another person being born as a Brahmin, or another person being born, you know, in some more privileged situation? Like, how do we explain that?
Okay, thank you, Venerable Tenzin. We all are, I think, in dialogue, and also we are in search of finding different answers for this question of suffering. Suffering is the hardest problem to understand, I think, and we are in search of different answers. And now it is time to wind up. I think, Minlun, okay, we should wind up now. And we are very, very grateful to all of you, especially to both of our speakers, Reverend Dr. Jesuretnam and Venerable Tenzin, for your wonderful presentations in two different perspectives, especially from the Book of Job, one of the most important and exciting book from the Old Testament. And also, Venerable Tenzin, for your wonderful presentation. And I thank Reverend Dr. Matthew Chandrangunel, the director of ECC, Ecumenical Christian Center, and also Minlun for organizing the program, and for different eminent venerable personalities for your presence from different parts of the world, and different ways of life and different faith traditions. And it was really enriching, and like last week, and we hope next week also we will come again, and we will contribute and enrich with our thoughts, with our insights, and we hope to see you next week. And thank you very much for your patience, for your contributions, for your presence, and for the interventions. And especially, once again, a big applause to all of you, and we clap for each other. Yeah, thank you very much. And over to Minlon for the conclusion.
Thank you so much, Father, for the skillful moderation, and we thank the presenters, Dr. Jesuranam and Venerable Tenzin Laksok, for the profound and very insightful presentations. Friends, before we end, I would like to make one information or announcement to you that as Father had dropped in the chat box, our next talk will be on coming Sunday, that is 7th of June, the same timing, 6:30 to 8. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening.